The social worker's car pulled up to the 11th house in 9 years. Norma Jeane Baker pressed her face against the cold window, watching another set of strangers waiting on another unfamiliar porch. She was 9 years old, carrying everything she owned in a paper grocery bag, and she'd learned by now not to unpack completely because she'd be moving again soon. They always sent her back. Every family, every home, every promise of, "You can stay with us," eventually ended the same way. "We're sorry, but we can't keep you anymore." And Norma Jeane would be back in that social worker's car, heading to another house where nobody really wanted her, where she was just a burden, just another unwanted child taking up space in someone else's life. But this time would be different, the social worker said. This family really wanted a little girl. Norma Jeane had heard that before. She'd heard it 10 times before. And she knew, with the terrible certainty that abandoned children develop early, that she'd hear it again before this story was over. June 1st, 1926. Los Angeles County Hospital. A baby girl was born to Gladys Pearl Baker, a film negative cutter who worked in the Hollywood studios. The father's name on the birth certificate was Edward Mortensen, but he'd abandoned Gladys during pregnancy and would never be part of the child's life. Gladys named her daughter Norma Jeane, after the movie stars Norma Talmadge and Jean Harlow, because even in that hospital bed, exhausted from labor and terrified about her future, Gladys was dreaming of Hollywood glamour. She was dreaming of a life nothing like the one she was actually living. Broke, alone, mentally unstable in ways she didn't fully understand yet, completely unprepared to raise a child. Gladys tried. That's important to remember. She tried to be a mother. But she was working 6 days a week at the film studios, earning barely enough to survive. She had no family support, no husband, no safety net. And she had something else too. Something she didn't talk about but that ran in her family like a curse. Mental illness. Gladys's mother had been institutionalized. Her brother had killed himself. And Gladys herself was beginning to experience the paranoid delusions and mood swings that would eventually destroy her ability to function. A mother alone, working constantly, mentally unraveling, trying to care for an infant in Depression-era Los Angeles, it was impossible. So Gladys made a decision that would shape her daughter's entire life. She gave Norma Jeane to a foster family. The first foster home was the Belenders, a religious couple in Hawthorne, California. Ida and Wayne Belender took in foster children for the small stipend the state provided, and they raised those children with strict evangelical Christianity and even stricter discipline. Norma Jeane lived with them from infancy until she was 7 years old. It should have felt like home. It was the longest she'd ever stay anywhere. But the Belenders made it clear she wasn't their daughter. She was a foster child, temporary, not really part of the family. They had their own children. And Norma Jeane understood even as a tiny child that she was different, less important, not really wanted. Just tolerated. Gladys would visit on weekends when she wasn't working. She'd bring small gifts, tell Norma Jeane stories about the movies, promise that someday they'd live together in a real house, just the two of them. Norma Jeane lived for those visits. She'd spend all week waiting for Saturday, hoping her mother would come, devastated when work kept her away. And when Gladys did come, Norma Jeane would cling to her, begging her not to leave, crying when the visit ended and her mother drove away. The Belenders would peel Norma Jeane's arms from around her mother's neck and carry her back inside while she screamed. Every single weekend that ended with Gladys leaving was a fresh abandonment. A reminder that Norma Jeane wasn't worth keeping. Wait until you hear what happened when Norma Jeane was 7, because that's when everything got worse. 33. Gladys had been saving money, working extra hours, trying to get stable enough to reclaim her daughter. She rented a small house on Arbel Drive in Hollywood, close to the studios where she worked. And she went to the Belenders and said, "I'm taking my daughter home." For the first time in her life, Norma Jeane was going to live with her actual mother in their actual home. She was ecstatic. This was what she'd dreamed about every night. A real family, her mother choosing her, a place where she belonged. They moved into that little house together, and for a few months, it was almost wonderful. Gladys was working hard but coming home to her daughter every night. They'd make dinner together. Gladys would tell stories about the movie stars she saw at the studio. Norma Jeane finally had what she'd always wanted, her mother. But Gladys was falling apart. The mental illness that had been manageable was accelerating. She was having paranoid episodes, convinced people at work were plotting against her. She'd stay up all night talking to herself, rambling about conspiracies. She'd forget to buy groceries, forget to pay rent, lose days to depression where she couldn't get out of bed. And Norma Jeane, 7 years old, tried to take care of her mother, tried to be good enough and quiet enough and helpful enough that her mother wouldn't send her away. She learned to make her own breakfast when Gladys couldn't get up. She learned to walk to school alone when her mother was too paranoid to leave the house. She learned to be invisible when Gladys was having an episode, hiding in her room until the storm passed. January 1934. Gladys had a complete mental breakdown. She started screaming in the middle of the night about enemies coming to kill her. She attacked a neighbor she thought was spying on her. The police were called. And Gladys Pearl Baker was taken to Norwalk State Hospital for the mentally ill, where she'd spend most of the rest of her life. Norma Jeane came home from school to find strangers in her house, her mother gone, and a social worker explaining that she was going back to foster care. The dream of living with her mother was over. Norma Jeane was 7 years old, and she understood with devastating clarity that she'd lost the one person who was supposed to love her unconditionally. She'd lost her mother not to death, but to something worse, to madness, to institutions, to a system that locked people away and threw away the key. The next few years were a nightmare of instability. Norma Jeane was moved from foster home to foster home, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. Some families were kind but overwhelmed. Some were cruel. Some took in foster children for the money and provided the bare minimum of care. Norma Jeane learned to pack her belongings quickly, to not get attached to toys or clothes because she might have to leave them behind. She learned to be quiet and obedient, trying desperately to be good enough that families would keep her. It never worked. Something always happened. The family's financial situation changed, or they decided fostering was too hard, or they were moving, or they just didn't want her anymore. And Norma Jeane would be back in that social worker's car, heading to another temporary home, but you won't believe what happened at one of those homes, and this is where the story gets even darker. One of the foster families had a relative who lived with them. A man, much older than Norma Jeane, who paid attention to her in ways that felt wrong, even though she was too young to understand why. He'd come into her room at night. He'd touch her in ways that made her freeze, her whole body going rigid with fear and confusion. She was 8 years old, maybe 9, and she didn't have the language to explain what was happening. She didn't know that what he was doing was called sexual abuse. She just knew it made her feel dirty and scared and helpless. And when she finally tried to tell the foster mother what was happening, hoping someone would protect her, the woman didn't believe her. Or worse, she believed her but blamed Norma Jeane for it. Said she must have been asking for it somehow, must have encouraged him, must have wanted the attention. And Norma Jeane learned a lesson that would poison the rest of her life. When bad things happen to you, nobody will protect you. They'll blame you instead. The abuse continued. The foster mother did nothing, and Norma Jeane learned to dissociate, to leave her body when that man came into her room, to float somewhere else in her mind where this wasn't happening. She learned that her body wasn't really hers, that it was something that could be used by other people without her consent, that her only value was what other people could take from her. These lessons, learned at 8, at 9, at 10 years old, would shape everything about how Marilyn Monroe later related to her body, to sex, to the men who desired her. This is exactly where everything changed, because Norma Jeane started creating a fantasy life to escape the nightmare she was living. She'd go to the movies whenever she could scrape together a dime. She'd sit in the dark theater and watch women on screen, Jean Harlow, Carole Lombard, Ginger Rogers, who were beautiful and adored and powerful. Women who lived in beautiful houses and wore beautiful clothes and had men who loved them. Women who were nothing like Norma Jeane Baker, the unwanted foster child nobody loved. And Norma Jeane started to dream. What if she could become one of those women? What if she could transform herself so completely that nobody would ever know about the foster homes and the abuse and the mother in the mental institution? What if she could become someone else entirely? Someone who was wanted, loved, safe. 1935. After years bouncing between foster homes, Norma Jeane was placed in the Los Angeles orphanage. This wasn't supposed to happen. Children with living parents weren't supposed to go to orphanages. But Gladys was institutionalized indefinitely, and there were no foster homes available that would take Norma Jeane, and the state had nowhere else to put her. So at 9 years old, she became an orphan despite having a mother who was technically alive. The orphanage was massive, impersonal, overcrowded. Rows and rows of beds filled with unwanted children. Strict schedules and stricter rules. No privacy, no safety, no tenderness. Just survival. Norma Jeane lasted 2 years in that orphanage, and they were the 2 worst years of her childhood. She was surrounded by other abandoned children, all of them damaged in different ways, all of them competing for the tiny scraps of attention the overworked staff could provide. She was bullied by older kids. She was punished for minor infractions, talking after lights out, not finishing her food, daydreaming during chores. She learned that showing emotion was dangerous, that crying made you a target, that the only way to survive was to become invisible. And she perfected the skill that would define the rest of her life, performing, being whatever the adults needed her to be, smiling when they wanted her to smile, being quiet when they wanted her quiet, becoming a perfect, compliant, invisible good girl who gave them no trouble and asked for nothing. But inside, where nobody could see, Norma Jeane was planning her escape. Not a physical escape. She was 9, then 10, then 11, with nowhere to go and no one to help her. But an emotional escape. She was creating a character, a fantasy version of herself who wasn't Norma Jeane Baker the orphan. She was creating someone who would be beautiful enough, charming enough, valuable enough that people would want her, would keep her, would never send her away. She didn't know yet that this fantasy character would eventually be called Marilyn Monroe. But she was building it already, piece by piece. In the only place she had any control, her imagination. Don't miss this next part, because it's crucial to understanding everything that came later. The orphanage had a library. It was small, mostly just donated books nobody wanted, but it was the only place in that massive, cold building where Norma Jeane felt safe. She'd spend every free minute there, reading everything she could find. She read about faraway places where children weren't abandoned. She read romance novels where the heroine always got rescued by someone who loved her. And she read movie magazines, studying the photographs of stars, memorizing their smiles, their poses, the way they held themselves with confidence she couldn't even imagine. She was teaching herself how to be someone else, someone worth loving. 1937. A family friend of her mother's, Grace McKee, started visiting Norma Jeane at the orphanage. Grace worked in the film industry like Gladys had. And she'd promised Gladys years ago that if anything happened to her, she'd look after Norma Jeane. It had taken Grace 2 years to track down where the child had been placed, but finally she found her. And Grace was horrified by what she found. This skinny, withdrawn, terrified 11-year-old who'd been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to care for her. Grace started the process of becoming Norma Jeane's legal guardian and getting her out of that orphanage, but wait until you hear what Grace did that changed. Everything, though whether it made things better or worse is still debated. Grace McKee was obsessed with Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde bombshell who died that same year at only 26. And when Grace looked at Norma Jeane, she saw potential. The girl had good bone structure, pretty eyes, a vulnerable quality that could be marketable. And Grace started putting ideas in Norma Jeane's head. You could be a movie star. You could be the next Jean Harlow. You're pretty enough. You just need to learn how to present yourself. Grace took Norma Jeane out of the orphanage and brought her to live with her family. And she started grooming Norma Jeane, not sexually but professionally, teaching her how to do her makeup, how to walk, how to smile, How to use her femininity as currency. How to become the kind of woman men would want to look at, to photograph, to put in movies. Norma Jeane was 11, 12, 13, still a child, but Grace was already training her to be a sex symbol. And Norma Jeane absorbed every lesson because she'd learned that the only value she had was in being wanted by other people. If she could make herself pretty enough, charming enough, sexy enough, maybe someone would finally keep her. Maybe someone would finally love her. The abuse she'd experienced in foster care had already taught her that her body was her only currency. Now Grace was teaching her how to maximize that currency's value. The thing is, Grace meant well. She genuinely wanted to help Norma Jeane escape poverty and have a better life than her mother had. And in 1930s America, for a girl with no education, no family, no resources, using her looks to get ahead was one of the very few options available. Grace was teaching Norma Jeane survival skills for the world they actually lived in, not the world that should have existed. But in the process, she was reinforcing every lesson that abuse and abandonment had already taught. You are valuable only for what men want from you. Your worth is in your appearance. Love and security come from being desirable. You have no value beyond your body. 38, 1941. Norma Jeane lived with Grace's family, then with Grace's aunt Anna Lower, when Grace's marriage fell apart and she could no longer keep the girl. Anna was kind, maybe the first genuinely kind adult Norma Jeane had encountered since early childhood. Anna was a Christian Scientist who believed in the inherent worth of every person, who treated Norma Jeane with tenderness, who didn't see her as a burden or a foster child or a project, but as a human being deserving of love. Norma Jeane later said that Anna Lower was the only person who truly loved her during her childhood, the only adult who made her feel safe. But Anna was aging and couldn't be a permanent guardian. And Grace was still Norma Jeane's legal guardian, still making decisions about her future. And in 1942, when Norma Jeane was 16 and Grace was struggling financially, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She arranged for Norma Jeane to marry the boy next door. His name was Jim Dougherty. He was 21. Norma Jeane was 16. She barely knew him. But the alternative, Grace explained, was going back to the orphanage. And Norma Jeane would do anything. Marry a stranger, give up her childhood, commit to a life she hadn't chosen, rather than go back to that place. June 19, 1942. Norma Jeane Baker married James Dougherty 2 weeks after her 16th birthday. She wore a white dress borrowed from Grace. She had no family at the wedding. Her mother was still institutionalized. Her father was unknown. She'd lost contact with the Bolenders years ago. Just Grace and a few of Grace's friends, watching this child bride marry a man she didn't love because the alternative was being nobody's responsibility at all. And Norma Jeane stood at that altar and made vows she was too young to understand, knowing that marriage was just another form of foster care, another temporary home with another person who might decide they didn't want her anymore. But here's where the origin story of Marilyn Monroe really begins. Because Norma Jeane Baker had survived 11 foster homes, sexual abuse, an orphanage, institutionalization of her mother, and complete abandonment by everyone who was supposed to protect her. She'd learned that she had no inherent value. She'd learned that love was conditional. She'd learned that her body was currency. She'd learned to perform, to become whatever people needed her to be. She'd learned to dissociate from her real self and inhabit a character. And she'd spent years in that orphanage library studying how to transform herself into someone completely different, someone beautiful, desirable, powerful, loved, someone who would never be sent back, someone who would never be abandoned again. Norma Jeane Baker was creating Marilyn Monroe long before anyone called her by that name. She was creating a character who would be everything she wasn't. Confident instead of terrified, desired instead of abandoned, powerful instead of helpless, loved instead of discarded. And that character would eventually become so famous, so iconic, so overwhelming that the real woman underneath would disappear completely. Norma Jeane's ultimate escape fantasy, becoming someone else entirely, would work too well. She'd become Marilyn Monroe, and Marilyn Monroe would be adored by millions. But the price would be that nobody, including herself, would ever know or love Norma Jeane Baker again. You haven't seen the most heartbreaking part yet, though. Because decades later, when Marilyn Monroe was the most famous woman in the world, she'd still be that little girl pressing her face against the social worker's car window, waiting to be wanted. She'd still be asking every man she met, "Will you keep me? Will you love me? Will you not send me back?" She'd still be terrified that she'd wake up one day and everyone would see she was just Norma Jeane after all, just the unwanted foster child nobody wanted to keep. And they'd send her back to the orphanage. The childhood trauma that created Marilyn Monroe never healed. It couldn't heal. Because Norma Jeane learned at 7, at 8, at 9 years old that she was fundamentally unlovable. And no amount of fame, no amount of beauty, no amount of men desiring her could ever prove that wrong. Because desire isn't love. Attention isn't safety. Fame isn't family. And Marilyn Monroe would spend her entire short life searching desperately for what Norma Jeane Baker had never received. Unconditional love from someone who wouldn't abandon her. The foster care system had taught her that love was always temporary. The abuse had taught her that her body would be used regardless of her consent. The orphanage had taught her that she was disposable. Her mother's abandonment through mental illness had taught her that even parents leave. And Grace McKee's well-intentioned grooming had taught her that her value was in her sexual appeal to men, not in her inherent worth as a human being. Every single lesson of childhood had been about unworthiness, about abandonment, about the fact that Norma Jeane Baker didn't deserve to be kept. And then, Marilyn Monroe became the most desired woman in the world. And it didn't fix anything. Because you can't heal childhood abandonment trauma with adult success. You can't fix nobody wanted me with everybody wants to look at me. Those are two completely different kinds of wanting. The little girl who needed one person to keep her, to stay, to love her unconditionally, never got that. And the grown woman who had millions of people desire her still felt that absence like an open wound that never closed. This is why Marilyn Monroe's story is so devastating. She wasn't just a tragic movie star who died young. She was a foster child who never stopped being a foster child, who never found a permanent home, who never felt safe enough to stop performing. Every marriage was another foster home she'd be sent away from eventually. Every movie role was another chance to be good enough that they'd keep her. Every photograph was proof that she was desirable enough to be worth something. But none of it could fill the hole that 11 foster homes in 9 years had carved into her soul. The woman who would become the most iconic female figure of the 20th century started as the child nobody wanted. The woman whose image would be reproduced millions of times, whose name would be synonymous with beauty and sex appeal, started as the little girl crying in a social worker's car because another family had sent her back. The woman who'd be desired by presidents and worshipped by millions started as the child who learned that her body was something that could be used by adults without her permission. And that origin story explains everything that came after: the insecurity, the need for constant validation, the inability to trust anyone's love, the addiction to pills that promised to quiet, the voice inside that still said, "Nobody wants you," the tragic early death of a woman who never learned that she deserved to be loved for who she was, rather than what she looked like. Norma Jeane Baker created Marilyn Monroe as an escape from trauma. But you can't escape your childhood. You can only perform not having it. And performance, no matter how perfect, no matter how successful, no matter how adored, is exhausting. Eventually, everyone gets tired. Eventually, the mask slips. Eventually, the performance ends. August 5th, 1962. Marilyn Monroe died alone in her bedroom in Brentwood, California, surrounded by empty pill bottles. She was 36 years old. She'd been married 3 times, and all 3 marriages had ended. She'd been desired by millions, and she'd died feeling unloved. She'd become the most famous woman in the world, and she'd never escaped being that unwanted foster child. Because fame doesn't heal trauma. Beauty doesn't cure abandonment. Success doesn't fill the void left by childhood neglect and abuse. And Marilyn Monroe, born Norma Jeane Baker. Abandoned in 1926, shuffled through 11 homes in 9 years, abused in foster care, locked in an orphanage, taught that her only value was sexual, raised to perform rather than to be. Never had a chance at the one thing she needed most, to be loved as herself, not as the character she'd created to survive. The story of Marilyn Monroe is the story of Norma Jeane Baker. And the story of Norma Jeane Baker is the story of a child the system failed so completely that she spent the rest of her life trying to become someone else entirely. It worked. She became Marilyn Monroe, and Marilyn Monroe became immortal. But Norma Jeane Baker, the real girl underneath the performance, was lost forever, abandoned one final time when the character she'd created consumed her completely. That's the real tragedy. Not that Marilyn Monroe died young, but that Norma Jeane Baker never got to live at all. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. How do childhood wounds shape adult lives? Can fame and success ever heal deep trauma? What would have helped Norma Jeane Marilyn find peace? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more deep dives into the human stories behind Hollywood legends, the childhood that shaped everything, and the truth behind the icon. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.